I was born in Temple, Texas, to a military dad. And so we didn't live in Temple very long because I actually went through first grade in 3 different states because he had a weapons specialty. And so it was in the middle of the Korean War and then, of course, the Vietnam War. Those all were wars that affected how often we moved. That was typical of my growing up lifestyle, not ever being firmly rooted in any one place, having to constantly deal with being the new kid on the block and diversity, switching between military and civilian schools all the time. And I think it gave me a necessary stamina and a resilience. Things changed when Dad retired when I was 10 years old. He retired from the military in 1963, and we were stationed at Fort Belvoir, Virginia at the time. And it was on a trip in a wooden station wagon going from Fort Belvoir to Texas because Mom had persuaded him that we were going to live in Texas permanently after that. My dad stopped at this gas station, and back then you had the station attendants who actually pumped the gas. You didn't do it yourself. And so while the attendant was pumping the gas, Dad decides to go use the bathroom. And as he's coming out of the bathroom, the station attendant hollers at him, "You used the wrong bathroom. You used the wrong bathroom." And Dad looked up, he said, "No, I used the men's room," because he thought the station attendant meant he used the women's room. But what the guy actually meant, that Dad hadn't paused to stop to think that he should go around to the colored bathroom, wherever that was. And so they got into this argument. Dad flung the money at the guy and we drove off. We thought it was over. But like 10 minutes down the road, this was in Mississippi, I should add. 10 minutes down the road, this car of white people, I didn't know because I was only 10 at the time, drove up beside us and fired a shot at our car, missing everything, but they did fire the shot. So Dad literally slammed on his brakes, pulled off to the side of the road. Mom screaming, all the kids are screaming because Mom's screaming. Dad, cool as a cucumber, goes and roots around the back of the station wagon and pulls out this rifle because he probably knew these kids were coming back. So these kids, they U-turn and they come back towards us, and Dad very intentionally fires a shot over their heads because he's a weapons specialist. He could have killed all 4 of them before they knew anything was happening. And so that just made us scream louder and more fiercely. It wasn't until I got much older, I realized that those were probably some scared kids. I had a best friend named Debbie who was white, and we were playing outside, and I took her doll away from her. You know how kids snatch toys between each other? Well, I took Debbie's doll, and Debbie called me a nigger. And I didn't know what the word meant. So I said, "Well, you're a nigger too." And then we kept on playing and blah, blah, blah. No big deal, right? But that night at dinner, I asked Mom, I said, "Mom, what's a nigger?" And she went ballistic. "Where did you hear that? La, 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 la. La, la, la." Her overreaction was so dramatic and traumatic. I've never known my mom and dad to go off like that, ever. And we were such a passive aggressive household with no fighting or anything. That was unusual. My father outranked everybody in our neighborhood. And we were in predominantly white neighborhoods. And in the Army, the sins of the children are visited on the father. So there's a commanded politeness when a kid knows that their father could lose a stripe if they piss my father off. And that taught me that it is possible to teach white kids not to exhibit racism, because that's what I had the first 10 years of my life. Civilian life was traumatic for me because the cocoon was gone. We were in a predominantly Black neighborhood. It wasn't integrated anymore. When we moved to Texas, my mother had to start a Girl Scout troop for Black girls because we weren't allowed to go to the Girl Scout troop for white girls. And it was on a Girl Scout outing that I was kidnapped and raped by this GI when I was 11 years old. And so that was traumatic. 3 years later, my 27-year-old cousin decided to have sex with me, even though he was married. But he used to get me drunk as a way of manufacturing consent, and I went along with it because I thought I was being treated as an adult. Didn't know that it was totally statutory rape at the time. Became pregnant from that. Ended up having a baby at 15. My parents had to threaten to sue. We didn't actually go through with the lawsuit. The San Antonio Independent School System, because it was very common to kick girls out of school for being pregnant. Watching my parents fight a big institution and winning, because they quickly readmitted me after they threatened a lawsuit. But it wasn't until I was 16, because I graduated high school, that I went to Howard University. And that's when somebody put a copy of Alex Haley's the autobiography of Malcolm X and Tony Cade's The Black Woman in my hand. And I think that's when my early leadership stuff started appearing. Somehow I got elected vice president of my freshman class. So that brought me into the middle of student activism at the time. Washington, D.C. in 1970 was still a hotbed of civil unrest. Dr. King had been killed in 68. We had almost daily, monthly, weekly riots, or what they call riots. It was uprising and protest, but they would call them riots. It was the surroundings that I was in that had the most profound impact on my consciousness. Not nothing I did independently, but the fact that it was hard not to be woke when you're in a turbulent college in a turbulent city at a turbulent time. So one of my college professors tell me how angry I was at Black men, and I hadn't processed that. I hadn't recognized that, and I hadn't recognized how distrustful I was of them. I never was intimidated, I think, by white people, because my education had been so white. Howard University was my first Black educational experience. I never remembered feeling any particular way about white people, because they were just people to me. And I think that predisposed me to what I do now, call myself the white girl whisperer, because I'm really good at telling hard truths to white people in a loving way. The activism came out of a very specific moment. I moved from the dormitory into an apartment with my son. And it was a small efficiency apartment. Came home one day from work. There was a notice taped on all the doors saying that we had 90 days to move. We met down in the basement of the building, which was the laundry room, the only room big enough to hold all the tenants. And I started keeping notes about different strategies to resist this eviction. And because I had the notes, I became the tenant president. Only because I had the notes. There was no vote. There was no formal affirmation. It just, I had the notes. And so what in the notes was a name of a group called the Citywide Housing Coalition, which was a coalition of tenants trying to keep the gentrification from happening and the condo conversions. And they were trying to pass the city's first rent control law and all of that. And they did actually pass DC's first rent control law in 1974. That tenants association that we started ended up buying the building. The next significant milestone, though, was while I was at a Citywide Housing Coalition meeting, I met this woman named Mackenzie Ture, and she was the executive director of the DC Rape Crisis Center, but she'd also been a member of the Black Panther Party. She had a real impact on my consciousness. I was in awe of anybody who'd been in the Black Panthers. I thought those were the hardcore revolutionaries. I felt like a dilettante compared to her. And she persuaded me to come over to the Rape Crisis Center as a volunteer. And then I succeeded her as executive director. So that's when my feminist consciousness started developing. And it was at the Rape Crisis Center that I started telling my rape stories for the first time, because I hadn't told anybody outside of, my family knew, but nobody else knew outside of that. And that's when I started attaching words to my experiences and found out that I wasn't alone. I mean, it's close to 25% of Black girls don't get out of childhood without adult men preying on us. It was very healing to be in the company of so many women who also had experienced trauma and so many older women. That's when we had started a project called Prisoners Against Rape with the men down at Lorton Reformatory and stuff. So I found myself as a rape survivor going to teach Black feminist theory to incarcerated Black men who had raped and murdered Black women. I told you I had a fear of men, right? That really tested it. So when I got to the room where the guys had assembled, I mean, they scared the shit out of me. William Fuller wrote this letter and said, outside I raped women, inside I raped men. I'd like not to be a rapist anymore. And I hadn't realized the import of that letter. I sat down and I didn't have a plan, I didn't have a pedagogy, I didn't have any thought. And I told my own story about the rapes that had happened to me. And then they started telling the stories about the rapes that had happened to them. And then once we started it, and that same magic worked. When you tell your story and other people unburden themselves, then you're no longer afraid of them anymore. Till I worked with them, I had not considered male rape. It had not been an issue. Older boys raping younger boys was a gang initiation strategy. So that was life-changing. I formed a group called the International Council of African Women. I wasn't trying to form new organizations of Black women. I was trying to pull them all together to send delegations to the World Conferences for Women. By being the first rape crisis center in the country and therefore the world, we got visited by a lot of international delegations. And we wrote a book called How to Start a Rape Crisis Center. We were the center of learning for other people who wanted to replicate our model. It was through the anti-rape work that was going global that my consciousness around global activities and global feminism was getting, intrigued. Because it was 1985, I took the job at NOW, the National Organization for Women. I guess that's when my career as a professional feminist took off. My next job after that was with Reverend C.T. Vivian and the National Anti-Klan Network. They renamed themselves the Center for Democratic Renewal. And that's where I ended up talking to guys and women in the hate movement. That's where I actually call it my second epiphany. It was in the deprogramming and the conversations with people in hate movements. What I found is that many of them became involved in hate activities because of the trauma going on in their own lives. Many of them grew up without ever meeting a Black person or a Jewish person or a Mexican. They grew up in all these white towns where they didn't have any diversity to fight against, but they all had some form of childhood trauma, whether it was being bullied as a male child or being sexually abused as a girl child, economically marginal and being seen as white trash by the more affluent white community. There was always a trauma story, always one. And that's what made them vulnerable to being recruited by people, because they would give them this faux compassion that pretended they actually cared about them, where nobody else had ever cared about them, apparently, as they felt in their lives. One guy, Floyd Cochran, said, I was bullied as a kid and I was walking around afraid of everybody, but when I put on that swastika, then they became afraid of me. I can understand that. Right? And so that's what they all say. Once I joined the hate movement, then people started respecting me, people started caring for me, and people became afraid of me. That consistency across all of the different groups and the people I had met revealed to me that they'd had a body of experiences that I don't think the larger public knows, that they assumed that they became a member of the hate groups because they had a bad experience with Jews, or they had a bad experience with Black people, or they saw a Mexican take their jobs. That ain't it at all. It's their bad experiences with other white people that push them into the hate movement. The thing that I say most consistently is don't believe Hollywood. The people that I'm able to reach are the people who already had their personal epiphanies long before they met me, or they wouldn't reach out to my organizations like mine. So no, you don't go inside the Klan and flip somebody. They had their epiphanies first, and that's what made them call an organization like mine for assistance. It's really hard to make another person change their minds or habits. So we don't have that magical superpower. What we have is a loving, listening attention for them. Take their suffering seriously, as we say, even if you don't agree with their analysis of why they're suffering. The fact their suffering is still real. They don't know how to live in normal society anymore. They're used to being so asymmetrical to society that they don't know how to be symmetrical with society anymore. When I think about my experiences in 1972, there was no national conversation on violence against women until we opened up the Rape Crisis Center. And 50 years later, will be the 50th anniversary of the Rape Crisis Center. That's evolved into a whole Me Too movement that's getting people fired. And that's a tremendous cultural shift in a fairly short period of time. Now we're having a backlash to anti-racist training and all this stuff that's taking place amongst in our schools, and white men are the victims and all of that stuff. But they're having that bad reaction because the change is happening. If things were not happening, they wouldn't be passing voting rights restrictions in 43 states. Their desperation is a sign of our victory and our power. But we are dealing with an opponent that, like in the Civil War, would rather topple democracy than share it. That's disappointing because the nature of the threat has not changed. But I like the fact that our resistance to it is getting bigger and broader and more effective. Every white population in America has always voted for the candidate that they felt most represented their white grievances. But something significantly shifted in 2020. Like I said, every demographic that was white voted for Trump except for one. Young white voters, 18 to 29. 56% of them voted for Biden. They're the first generation to break with white supremacy ever in the history of America. That's an intergenerational split among white people we've never seen before. Well, I say that I don't regret anything that happened to me because it made me the woman that I am today. Uh, you know, like we have a saying in the Black community, smooth seas don't make a good sailor. It's the rough seas that make a good sailor. And so we really need to be more forgiving of each other, just as individuals to individuals, socially, group to group, country to country. A real strong lesson from the massacre at the Charleston Church of the 9 church members by Dylan Roof. And Chris Singleton's mother was killed in that massacre. But he said in an interview is that a lot of people think that forgiveness is weakness. But in fact, it is the most strongest way I can do to reclaim my soul, because I don't want that murderer's fingerprint on my soul forever. I want to remember my mother without that murderer. That's the power of forgiveness to me. It's a reclamation of dignity. It's a statement of you shall not stain my soul forever, simply because that's who you are. Well, I'm going to tell you who I am, despite you. Well, the way I teach it in my calling in classes to these young kids, I said, just just examine for yourself how holding a grudge has worked for you. Has it brought you any happiness? Has it brought you any peace? Has it made you feel stronger? If you can't answer yes to those questions, you need to worry about why you're holding that grudge. There's a meme going out about me on Facebook because I gave a speech last week, and I always drop this stuff and I don't even know what the significance of it. And they were talking about intergenerational work, and I said, well, I'm not ready to pass my torch because I'm still setting shit on fire. And apparently that made a Facebook meme, and so it's going out. And that's kind of how I feel.